thought I would give you a brief overview of the Locarno Conference. And so let's start with that. The Locarno Conference was held in 1925, late 1925, after the Ruhr crisis, after Streseman's policy of fulfillment. And I think it's important to see the Locarno Conference as part of that whole sort of movement of events where Germany becomes more legitimized on the international scene following the Ruhr crisis, following Streseman's attempts to acknowledge Germany's obligations with regard to the Treaty of Versailles. And so, again, remember that's the broader context of this whole issue. So anyway, in 1925, the major powers of Europe, Germany, France, Great Britain, along with Italy and Belgium, in addition to Czechoslovakia and Poland, meet at Locarno, Switzerland, in order to really try to settle some of the disputes that had plagued Europe since the end of World War I. As you know, the Locarno Conference, the three people who were kind of the bigwigs there would be Austen Chamberlain, the British Foreign Secretary, the French Prime Minister Aristide Briand, and as well as the German Prime Minister Stresemann, Gustav Stresemann. Anyway, so it's those three people who are kind of calling the shots in some ways. What you need to remember is that there are basically three types of treaties that come out of the Locarno Conference. The first one, sometimes called the Rhineland Pact, I should say, basically acknowledged Germany's acceptance of its western borders. Essentially that the boundaries defined by the Treaty of Versailles between Germany and Belgium and Germany and France were permanent, and that Germany would not contest those. And basically Great Britain and Italy give their promise to defend any of those three countries if they would be attacked. And I think that's significant, as we've talked about in class, that guarantee, particularly by Great Britain. It really adds credibility to the whole agreement. Secondly, there were a series of arbitration agreements, 4 in total, between Germany and France, Germany and Belgium, Germany and Poland, and Germany and Czechoslovakia. Now, again, the difference is that the agreements between Germany and Belgium and Germany and France were put within the framework of the Rhineland Pact. So basically, again, they were under that umbrella of British protection ultimately. While in the case of the agreements between Germany and Czechoslovakia and Germany and Poland, they didn't have that same sort of promise that Great Britain gave to France and Belgium. And again, we've talked about that and how important that is, because it seems to indicate that Great Britain may have had a willingness to one day see Germany recapture some of the territories that it had lost in Eastern Europe following the end of World War I, or perhaps that it would incorporate the Sudetenland one day into Germany, which of course was not ever part of Germany, was part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, but still had about 3 million Germans. And so anyway, I think that's significant. Anyway, and there was also, again, a third type of treaty, which was basically a defense treaty that France signed with both Czechoslovakia and Poland, separate treaties. And so that's the whole gist of the Locarno Conference. The Locarno Conference was very popular in many circles in Europe. When the treaties were signed, many people saw it as the dawning of a new age of sort of peace in Europe, of prosperity in Europe. But again, as we've talked about in class, it really hid in some ways a lot of problems. First of all, it did not solve the weaknesses of collective security. The idea that a country would actually go defend another country, even though it was not really in the self-interest of the first country to do so, I mean, really perhaps was unrealistic in some ways, and perhaps too idealistic, I guess is a better word. Secondly, Germany still had aspirations for gaining back territory in Eastern Europe, and we know that. It had signed the secret Treaty of Rapallo, or at least part of the Treaty of Rapallo was secret, with the USSR in 1922, particularly the provision that the Russians would secretly train their military, the Germans would secretly train their military in Russian territory, while the Germans would provide the Russians with training, with more sophisticated technology. And we know that both the Russians and the Poles certainly had their eyes upon, we know the Russians and the Germans both had their eyes upon Poland, so they had a mutual desire to sort of again regain territories they had lost as a result of World War One. Anyway, though, I think that we can't deny that there was a certain spirit of Locarno that pervaded Europe following 1925. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926, became one of the leading members of the Council. The Allied troops left the Rhineland in the 1920s. Basically, all Allied troops left Germany also by the late 1920s. We also talked briefly about the Kellogg-Briand Treaty in 1928, that idea to abolish war. Perhaps idealistic, but I think also it's an indication of how hopeful people felt during that period following the signing of the Locarno Treaty. One other point I want you to remember is that this treaty, although Stresemann won the Nobel Prize for it, was certainly not popular with all Germans. Many Germans felt that Stresemann had given up the western frontier of Germany, particularly Alsace-Lorraine, permanently to France, and this did not sit well with a lot of German nationalists. So I just want you to know that he was not certainly a hero for many Germans. In fact, he was considered a sellout individual by many in the country. Not everybody, but certainly a segment of the population. Anyway, those are just a few notes or a few comments I wanted to make on the Locarno Conference. I think it's an important event in the 1920s. It's an attempt at peacemaking, but again, I think that in some ways it really was a bit too idealistic and did not really reflect the fragility of the situation in Europe, even in the midst of relative prosperity in the 1920s.